They came at 6 o'clock in the morning. Number notice. No knock. Just chainsaws. Crack, crack, crack. Chewing through 60-year-old white oaks at the edge of my property. By the time I got my boots on, 4 trees were already stumps. Smoking sap, bleeding, orange-ringed stumps. The smell hit me like a fist. Fresh-cut wood and 2-stroke exhaust, still thick in the cold morning air. I walked straight up to the woman running the show, pressed blazer, HOA lanyard, standing on my land, like she owned it. She looked me dead in the eye. We're clearing this for water drainage. We have every right. Talk to our attorney. Pripster voice wasn't angry, just flat, the voice of someone who had already decided how this ended before she got out of the car. My trees, my land, her water problem. What Renata Holloway never checked before. She fired up those saws was what those trees were sitting in front of. A lake, 3 acres spring-fed in my family since 1961, every drop of it mine, and she was about to find out exactly what that meant. What would you do if you woke up to this? Drop it below. And where are you watching from? My name is Garrett Winslow, 53 years old, 3rd-generation Tensian, and I have exactly 0 interest in drama. I run a small excavation company out of Cookville, 12 employees, 2 excavators, a fleet of dump trucks permanently scented with red clay and diesel. We grade foundations, dig drainage channels, fix what floods ruin. I know land the way a doctor knows bodies. I know what ground is worth and what it does when you ignore it. My grandfather, Earl Winslow, bought 42 acres in Bledsoe County back in 1961, back when you could do that with a good handshake, a survey stake, and a cashier's check for $11,000. He built a house, cleared fields, and left the back 20 acres wild because a natural spring-fed lake sat back there, roughly 3 acres, quiet and cold, and full of largemouth bass, the size of your forearm. That lake wasn't an amenity to Earl. It was a statement. He'd grown up with nothing, and owning a whole lake with your name on the deed meant something that went beyond money. When Earl died in 2002, the property came to my father. When my father passed 6 years ago, it came to me. I moved in, kept the fields leased to a local cattle operation, and left the back 20 acres exactly as Earl had left them. By then, a subdivision called Pinnerest Pines had grown up along the western fence line, 340 homes, neat brick fronts, vinyl fencing, identical black mailboxes, and landscaping rules so detailed they specified ornamental grass heights by season, and an HOA run by a woman named Renata Holloway. Let me describe Renata clearly, because you need to see her. 58 sharp featured, former regional manager at a Nashville property management firm. The kind of company that turns apartment complexes into profit centers and calls it community stewardship. She took early retirement, moved to Pinnerest Pines, and within 18 months had maneuvered into the HOA presidency. Not because she loved the community, because she needed something to run. Renata didn't yell at people. That's what made her dangerous. She sent emails at 11:30 at night, written in the precise, bloodless language of 20 years managing liability. She'd find a resident for the wrong shade of gray paint on a mailbox post. She'd blocked a veteran from installing a flagpole 4 in too tall. She'd sent a cease and desist to a widow for a garden hose left on the porch. She was the kind of person who read the fine print not to understand it, but to use it. And for 9 years, nobody in Pinnerest Pines had the knowledge or resources to fight back. That's not an accident. HOA tyrants depend on the gap between what they know and what their targets don't. I was not in the HOA. My land predated it by 40 years, but Pinnerest Pines had been quietly expanding, annexing common land, rewriting CC and R boundaries, and Renata had decided that my tree line was available for her purposes. She had a landscaping crew under contract. She had meetings with the zoning office. She had a plan built layer by patient layer. The first move came 14 months before the chainsaw morning. A letter on HOA letterhead informing me that unmaintained vegetation along my eastern boundary constituted a nuisance under County Ordinance 14C and that I had 30 days to clear it or the HOA would do so and bill me. I read it carefully. Ordinance 14C applied to municipal common areas, not private property, no jurisdiction whatsoever. I filed the letter in a manila folder and went back to work. Renata Holloway was not the kind of woman who sent one letter. The second letter arrived 3 months later, copied to the county zoning office, and a law firm in Crossville called Howard and Me, two partners who had done HOA contract work for years and had a financial incentive to keep the relationship going. The letter claimed my trees were obstructing natural water drainage into a retention pond on the HOA side of the fence, and that I was liable for flooding damage to Pinerist Pines' properties during heavy rain. This was calculated, not careless. Renata had reframed my property as a hazard to her community, and here's what she was counting on. Even a completely meritless legal accusation cost time and money to fight. Most working people, when they see a letter from a law firm, calculate that compliance is cheaper than defense. She had used this pressure before. She was betting I was the same. I drove out to the tree on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of October day, where the air smells like dry leaves and distant diesel, and the light turns amber around 4 o'clock, making everything look like old photographs. I walked the boundary slowly, taking photos crouching to study soil and drainage angles. My oaks were healthy, old growth trees managing that hillside's water flow the way they had for 60 years. The HOA's retention pond sat 140 feet inside their fence line. Number hydrological relationship existed. I wrote that down. What I also noticed, crouching near the fence line, was that the soil on the HOA side had been recently disturbed. Fresh tire tracks from a narrow wheelbase machine, skid steer probably, and the grade had been altered so the slope now ran toward my property instead of away from it. Someone had physically redirected drainage deliberately recently. I took 47 GPS-tagged photos. Then I called Fo Drummond, my surveyor, 30 years, reading land in this county, whose field reports Bledsoe County courts receive like sworn testimony. Fo walked the line 2 days later, confirmed the regrading. Said the soil disturbance was 60 days old at most. He also found something I'd missed, a PVC pipe barely above the soil surface near the fence post, angled toward my property at about 15 degrees. Someone had installed drainage infrastructure designed specifically to push water off HOA land and onto mine. It wasn't obvious unless you knew what you were looking at, but once you saw it, you understood exactly what had been done. Garrett, Fo said, pulling off his cap and squinting at the pipe in the thin afternoon light. Somebody engineered a drainage problem and is now blaming you for causing it. The crunch of gravel under his boots was very loud in the silence after that sentence. I sent a certified letter to Howard and Me that week, measured, not aggressive. I informed them that I had retained a licensed surveyor who had documented unauthorized land modification along the boundary, that I was preserving all evidence, and that all future communications should go to my attorney. I didn't have an attorney yet, but they didn't know that. The tone of that letter bought me 10 days. The response arrived 11 days later, a certified package containing a formal demand letter and something I hadn't expected, a copy of a 2019 amendment to the Pinerist Pines, CC and RS, purporting to establish community easement rights over a strip of land along the subdivision's eastern boundary. The description was vague enough, deliberately I suspected to potentially include my tree line. They were claiming an easement on my land, filed 3 years ago, that I had never been notified of, never signed, and never agreed to. The demand letter gave me 60 days to acknowledge the easement, remove the obstructive vegetation, and reimburse the HOA $4,200 in administrative and landscaping preparation costs already incurred. I read it twice, then I called my cousin Darla. Vanderbilt Law, 15 years of property litigation before she moved home to raise goats and take cases that genuinely interested her. I laid out everything. She was quiet a long moment. Then, Garrett, go get your grandfather's original deed. Read every single word. Don't skip anything. I didn't know why she said that yet, but I went and got the deed. I found the deed in a fireproof lockbox in my father's old study, a room that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and motor oil, a combination that is somehow both melancholy and deeply comforting. A photocopy of a photocopy slightly blurred at the edges but legible. Earl Winslow, 42 acres, Bledsoe County, recorded March 14, 1961. The property description was in meets and bounds, compass bearings and distances from fixed points, beginning at an iron pin set in the ground at the intersection of the old Miller Road Rye, Fodder Way and the eastern bank of Cold Spring Run Creek, then north 47 degrees east, 380 feet. I read it slowly, the way Darla had asked. Near the bottom, I found a clause I'd never paid attention to before. A water rights clause. It read, "Grantee shall hold in fees simple, all riparian, and literal rights appurtenant to the described parcel, including but not limited to exclusive ownership of the unnamed, spring-fed impoundment lying wholly within the parcel boundaries, together with all subsurface water rights and all surface access rights thereto." Said impoundment being approximately 3.1 acres in area as of the date of this conveyance. Exclusive ownership of the lake, not just the land around it, the lake itself, the water column, the lake bed, the access rights, all of it, conveyed in fee simple passed by inheritance to me. I sat in my father's study for a while after reading that paragraph in the dark with the smell of pipe tobacco and motor oil around me, thinking about the 1961 attorney who had written those words. Somebody who understood that water in Tennessee was not a detail. Darla explained the full significance the next evening. Tennessee water law draws a sharp distinction between riparian rights, use rights held by landowners adjacent to water, and outright title to the water body itself. Most landowners have use and access rights only. Earl Winslow's deed explicitly conveyed title, ownership of the lake, not just proximity to it. Language that was uncommon in 1961 and rarer still today. And here's where Renata's entire scheme began unraveling from the inside. The spring feeding my lake didn't originate on my land. It originated uphill through what was now the Pinehurst Pines subdivision, running downhill through a natural drainage corridor before emerging on my property. That corridor was a natural watercourse. Under Tennessee Code annotated 696, artificia, redirecting a natural watercourse in a way that damages downstream property or impairs water rights is an actionable civil tort. If Renata's crew had regraded land and installed pipes that interfered with that spring's natural flow or introduced pollutants into it, she had committed a direct violation of my titled water rights. That PVC pipe photographed was no longer just evidence of trespass. It was potentially Exhibit A in a water rights impairment case. Takeaway: explicitly recorded water rights in a deed can transform a neighbor dispute into a water law case, and water law has teeth that HOA rules simply don't. I hired Darla formally the following week. She pulled the 2019 CCNR amendment from the county recorder's office and read it the way she reads every document, looking for what it's hiding as much as what it says. Her assessment came over coffee at my kitchen table, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, legal pad covered in handwriting beside her cup. "This easement is void," she said. "For an easement to have legal effect against the neighboring property owner, that owner must be notified, have the opportunity to object, and the easement must be recorded against their specific parcel. Renata filed this as a covenant amendment in the HOA's own records. It creates internal obligations between HOA members only. It has zero legal force against your deed. Whoever drafted it either didn't understand basic property law or was counting on you not understanding it." She paused, tapping her pen against the table. "Based on everything else I'm seeing, I don't think it was incompetence." She also noted something Howard and me apparently hadn't caught. The easement area described in the amendment extended 38 feet past the actual fence line into land that Foe's survey showed was unambiguously mine by deed, meaning when Renata's crew arrived with chainsaws, we weren't acting under a disputed easement. They were trespassing on titled private property, destroying timber with a clearly recorded deed owner with full knowledge that a formal legal objection had already been filed. The full picture was now clear. Renata had a retention capacity problem. The county had cited Pinehurst Pines twice for inadequate stormwater drainage. If she could reroute the spring and claim my lake as a supplemental retention basin, she solved a $300,000 engineering problem for free. The trees were the first obstacle. The fake easement was the cover, and I was supposed to be a dirt contractor who didn't know what his grandfather's attorney had written. 60 years ago, it was a sophisticated plan, methodical, corporate in its thinking. Renata had simply never met a man who'd actually read his deed. 2 weeks after Darla sent her formal response to Halloran and me, detailing the void easement, the water rights language, the documented regrading, the PVC pipe, and the potential TCAC's 9.6 violations, the chainsaws came. I still don't know exactly what triggered the acceleration. Maybe panic, Someone at Howlerin and me, realizing Darla's letter wasn't bluster, but an opening position from someone who had done her homework. Maybe Renata was advised that she needed visible action before the litigation clock locked everything in place. Maybe she simply couldn't tolerate losing an argument to a man who ran a dirt company. With certain kinds of people, the wound to pride is as real as any financial calculation. It was a Thursday in early November. A hard frost the night before had traced every blade of grass and silver, the kind of morning that makes the whole property look like it's been preserved in glass. I heard the chainsaws at 6:12. 4 trees were already stumps by the time I crossed the back field. My breath coming in clouds, boots crunching through the frozen grass. The 5th was being limbed while I was still walking. Ranatata Holloway stood 20 feet inside my fence line, pressed blazer despite the cold arms crossed, watching the crew with the flat, assessing expression of a person processing inventory, not feeling anything, just calculating. 2 of the crew wouldn't meet my eyes. 1 looked almost apologetic. The 4th kept his back to me the whole time. I won't tell you what I said first. It wasn't measured, and it lasted about 30 seconds before I caught myself, because I understood 2 things simultaneously. Losing my temper would help Renata, and I had been preparing for exactly this moment for weeks. I pulled out my phone, turned on video, said clearly, "Miss Holloway, you are standing on the private property of Garrett Winslow. I have not authorized any work on this land, and I have not authorized any work on this land, and I have not granted any easement. Please identify yourself and have your crew stop immediately." She didn't flinch. "We are acting under the community easement established in the 2019 CCNR amendment. This vegetation is being cleared, pursuant to the HOA's rights, under that document. If you have an objection, direct it to our attorney." "Please say that again for the camera," I said. She did nearly word for word. Whatever else you could say about Renata Holloway, she had discipline. I called the Bledsoe County Sheriff's Department while the crew was still running saws. Deputy Sarles arrived in 20 minutes. 5 trees were gone by then. 5 white oaks that had been standing on this land since before Ranatata was born. I showed Sorrells my deed, Darla's letter, Howlerin, and me's response, and Foe's GPS survey on my phone, the fence line and work area overlaid in red. Sorrells told the crew to cease operations and told Renata this was a civil property matter requiring resolution before further work could proceed. She cited established community rights in the tone of someone who finds bureaucratic process mildly inconvenient. Deputy Sorrells was unmoved. The crew packed their equipment. Ranatata walked to her black Lexus SUV without looking back. 5 stumps in the frost. That smell again. Fresh-cut wood, cold air, and underneath something sour from the exposed root systems like the earth reacting to what had been done to it. Darla filed 3 actions the following Monday. First, trespass seeking compensation for the willful removal of 5 mature white oaks from titled private property under Tennessee's timber trespass statute, TCA 43-261001. Damages for willful cutting can be trebled. A certified arborist assessed the trees, 5 60-year-old white oaks on a property with titled water rights. Assessment $34,000 trebled under the statute, $12,000 takeaway. Tennessee's timber trespass law allows treble damages for willful cutting. Removing someone's trees without legal right can cost 3 times the tree's appraised value. Second, a petition to void the 2019 CC&R easement amendment, as applied to my parcel, never properly noticed to me as the adjacent owner, never recorded against my title, describing land unambiguously, mine under a deed predating the HOA by 40 years. Third, a formal complaint to the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation alleging unlawful alteration of a natural water course and potential impairment of private water rights with Foe's drainage survey and 47 GPS-tagged photographs. Attached, that third filing, Darla noted with calm satisfaction, would generate a state investigation that neither Ranatata nor Howlerin and me could manage, delay, or quietly settle. 3-sidle title. Regulatory. Renata had built her scheme patiently over years. We had dismantled the foundation in 6 weeks and were now advancing from 3 directions at once. She had played stupid games on my land. Now it was time for prizes. The TDEC investigator was a compact businesslike woman named Agent Pruitt. mud boots, clipboard water sampling kit, and the systematic focus of someone who has watched a lot of people try to hide what they've done by burying it slightly below the surface. She found the PVC pipe, faux. She found 2 additional pipes he hadn't identified, older, partially buried, installed years before the recent regrading. And she found something none of us had anticipated. Evidence that the Pinehurst Pines drainage system had been discharging nutrient-lead as stormwater runoff into the natural spring corridor for at minimum 5 years without a permit, without notification, without any treatment or remediation. The spring feeding my grandfather's lake had been receiving residential stormwater runoff, lawn fertilizer, driveway oil drip, everything that washes off 340 homes during a rainstorm year after year, quietly. The on-site water testing came back with phosphorus and nitrate levels consistent with chronic residential discharge. The base had been getting smaller. The aquatic vegetation had been thickening. I'd been watching the lake degrade for 6 years and blamed drought. It wasn't weather, it was Pinehurst Pines. But here is what changed the entire dimension of the case. Here is what Darla called me about at 9:30 on a Wednesday night. Her voice carrying that particular quality of controlled excitement that good litigators develop when the discovery is larger than the lawsuit they started with. Agent Pruitt had cross-referenced the discharge findings with county environmental records and found that Pinehurst Pines had applied for a stormwater discharge permit in 2017 and been denied. The denial cited specifically that the proposed discharge point fell within the watershed of a privately owned water body, the spring corridor leading to my lake. The county had reviewed the application, identified my downstream water rights, and said no. Renata's organization had received that denial in writing, then proceeded to discharge anyway for 5 more years. That shifted the regulatory violation from negligence to willful noncompliance. Civil penalty exposure jumped significantly. Then Darla found the thread that unraveled the board entirely. The 2019 CCNR amendment had passed on a 5-member board vote. 3 of those 5 also sat on the HOA Landscape Subcommittee, the group that had contracted the drainage infrastructure work. 2 of those 3 had personally signed the landscaping contract, including the pipe installation. They had voted to create legal cover for a project they had directly authorized and overseen without disclosing that relationship to the membership. Under Tennessee HOA law, a board member who votes on a matter in which they hold an undisclosed personal interest has potentially breached their fiduciary duty to 340 homeowners who trusted them. This wasn't overreach. This was self-being documented in board minutes now in our possession. Garrett Darla said, "We have timber trespass, trespass to land, void easement, unlawful watercourse alteration, 5+ years of illegal discharge after a permit denial, and board members who voted to cover their own actions. This has a DA referral attached to it. This isn't a property dispute. This is a case." I was standing in my dark kitchen, looking toward the back acreage. "How exposed is Renata personally?" I asked. She signed the landscaping contract. She chaired every board meeting where the amendment was discussed and voted on. And my review of your video shows the crew ran saws for 11 minutes after the deputy told them to stop, before actually ceasing operations. She is the most exposed individual in this entire situation. The lake was quiet out there in the dark. Rico, varying slowly, not yet knowing what was coming. The next 6 weeks were the quietest and most productive of my adult life. On the surface, nothing visible was happening. No letters, no activity along the fence line. The HOA Facebook group, monitored through a neighbor's account, was full of holiday decorating reminders and a heated thread about whether inflatable lawn ornaments violated Section 4.7b of the community standards. Normal HOA noise. Under the surface, we were building something airtight. Darla brought in a water rights attorney from Nashville named Septon Engage. Lean, deliberate, mid-50s, 3 decades handling exactly this type of case. When I read him the deed's water rights clause, he asked me to read it again slowly. He set down his pen and nodded once, the way people nod when they're confirming something they suspected before they walked in the door. Septon explained the scope in terms a wire could follow. My grandfather's deed conveyed literal title, ownership of the lakebed and water column, not just the shoreline. Under Tennessee law, that is materially stronger than standard riparian rights, which convey use and access, but not title. Interfering with the spring that fed my lake, redirecting it, polluting it, diminishing its volume, was direct impairment of a titled property interest. We weren't just claiming tree damage, we were asserting a water asset impairment claim with a 1961 deed to back it up. He also identified something that expanded the case. The spring-fed lake, given its size and relationship to the natural watercourse, crossed a threshold under Tennessee environmental law, classifying it as waters of the state. That designation gave TDEC concurrent regulatory jurisdiction, regardless of private ownership. The HOA's illegal discharge wasn't only a civil matter, it was a state regulatory violation subject to enforcement, civil penalties, and in cases of documented willful non-compliance, potential criminal referral. Takeaway: when a privately owned spring-fed lake qualifies as waters of the state, regulatory agencies like TDEC can pursue enforcement independently, removing the matter from the HOA's ability to quietly settle. PEO prepared his formal survey and drainage analysis, 43 pages, GPS mapping, elevation cross-sections, and drainage modeling documenting exactly how the HOA's regrading and pipe network had altered the natural watercourse, by what volume, and over what timeline based on soil disturbance and pipe oxidation evidence. The kind of report that wins cases before a witness takes the stand. I installed trail cameras along the back fence line. Not hidden, I notified the HOA in writing that I was conducting security monitoring of my boundary in response to the documented trespass. Darla's reasoning: visible monitoring tends to cause overconfident people to confirm their state of mind. She was right. 3 weeks in, a camera captured a member of the HOA Landscape Committee walking my side of the fence with a tape measure at 7:15 in the morning. His face was clear on the footage. Darla sent a cease and desist with a screenshot attached. He never came back, but we had him on record, still operating under the belief that the void easement was valid. I also reached out quietly to 3 neighboring landowners outside Pinehurst Pines, but adjacent to it who'd had informal boundary clarification inquiries from the HOA in recent years. 2 had documents. The pattern was clear. Ranatata had been methodically testing neighboring properties for years, looking for the ones whose owners wouldn't look too closely at what was being proposed. Darla added those to the file under pattern of conduct toward adjacent landowners. The final preparation was the most satisfying: an environmental restoration. Company produced a formal lake assessment and certified remediation estimate for returning the lake to its pre-discharge baseline. The figure came back at $67,000, attached to a filed damage claim. It was now part of the court record. Total exposure on the table: $12,000 in treble timber damages, $67,000 in environmental remediation, recoverable attorney's fees under Tennessee's bad faith statute if we prevailed. TDEC civil penalties estimated at $34,000 minimum combined, well over $250,000 with Renata personally named in the trespass and fiduciary breach claims. Renata still thought this was a vegetation management disagreement. The Pinehurst Pines' annual homeowners meeting was scheduled for the second Saturday of February. All 340 households were entitled to attend. The venue, the community center on Pinehurst Boulevard, beige walls, folding chairs, a podium at the front, a whiteboard on wheels that had seen better decades. We circled that date on the calendar and started counting down. The week before the annual meeting, Renata made her move. 3 moves simultaneously, which is what people do when they're frightened, but haven't admitted it to themselves yet. Each one calculated, each one backfired. Move 1. She emailed my excavation company's largest client, Whitford Properties, a commercial real estate developer in Cookville, 9 years of continuous work, stating that Garrett Winslow's company was currently under investigation by TDEC for environmental violations related to a neighboring property dispute. That email was forwarded to me within the hour by Whitford's project manager with a single line: "Garrett, thought you should see this. We know what's actually happening." Not going anywhere. This was textbook defamation. I was not under investigation. Tents collapsed under the weight of the flood. Tent's investigation was directed entirely at Pinehurst Pines. Renata had taken a true fact that a TDEC investigation existed and reassigned its subject in writing to a named third party with the specific intent of causing economic harm. Darla added the defamation claim before I finished reading the forwarded email. Under Tennessee defamation law, Damages for business interference don't require proof of actual financial loss when the false statement is made with knowledge of its falsity. Move 2. Renata posted on the HOA Facebook group, 1,100 members, a platform she'd controlled for 9 years, that a neighboring landowner has filed frivolous legal claims in an attempt to interfere with routine community maintenance, and that the board is fully confident in its legal position. No mention of timber trespass. No mention of water rights or the $250,000 in filed claims. No mention of the tide investigation, the void easement, the illegal discharge, or the board members who voted to cover their own actions. The post got 209 likes. It also generated 7 questions from homeowners asking what the claims actually alleged, whether trees had really been cut on private property, and whether the membership could review the filed legal documents. Renata deleted all 7 comments within 40 minutes. My neighbor had screenshotted all 7 before they disappeared. Darla added them to the file. Deleting good faith membership questions about material financial risk had a name in fiduciary duty law, and it was not a flattering one. Move 3. Renata filed a complaint with the county zoning board, asserting that my unmaintained back acreage constituted a blighted area under county ordinance, requesting a formal inspection. The intent was layered: put me on defensive footing with county government, create a public record suggesting I was the negligent party, and cloud the TDEC picture by implying a legitimate dispute existed about whose land was the problem. The county inspector came out on a Wednesday. He walked 42 acres of healthy woodland, a spring-fed lake with elevated nutrient levels clearly originating from upstream residential sources, and 5 very fresh, very large tree stumps. His report found no violations on the Winslow property. It also noted, because he was thorough, evidence of recent alteration to a natural drainage feature along the eastern boundary, which he flagged for TTX follow-up. Renata had sent a county official to my property to discredit me. That official produced a government document corroborating my account of what had happened at the boundary. I did laugh when Darla read me that paragraph. I'm not ashamed of it. Through all 3 moves, Darla held me to one standard. Through all 3 moves, Darla held me to one standard. Do not respond publicly. Not on Facebook, not in letters, not in person. Every aggressive action Renata took was being documented. Every move was deepening the pattern. We were not playing defense. We were watching someone dig their own foundation and taking careful notes. The one thing I did quietly was visit a woman named Vera Castleberry. Vera was 81, had lived in Pinehurst Pines since its founding, and served on the original HOA board before Renata consolidated control. She called me unprompted, said she'd heard what was happening, and had been approached by 2 current board members about settling the matter quietly before the annual meeting. She wanted me to know. She also had HOA board meeting minutes from 2016 onward, including every meeting where the drainage scheme was discussed and the easement decision was made. She had kept them because something about those meetings had made her deeply uncomfortable, and she had learned in 81 years to keep physical copies of things that made her uncomfortable. Ver mailed me a 140-page envelope the following Wednesday. Darla drove out that evening, sat at my kitchen table, and read every page. It was, she said quietly, like someone handing you a searchlight when you were already holding 3. The week before the meeting, I did something Renata had no framework for, because in her model of power, people like me didn't do things like this. I went to see the Pinehurst Pines homeowners, not all of them. The ones who had asked pointed questions before Renata deleted their comments. The ones Vera had identified as privately uncomfortable with the board's direction. The ones who had over the years pushed back even slightly against the HOA's more aggressive moves. 6 doors across 5 days, no attorney, no stacks of documents. I brought 2 things, a 1-page TDEC complaint summary, and the water rights clause from my grandfather's deed. I introduced myself as the neighbor whose trees had been cut without notice. And I told each of them plainly and without legal jargon that their HOA board had exposed the entire Pinehurst Pines membership, every household, every owner to significant financial liability through decisions made without disclosure, without a membership vote, and without independent legal review. Here is what Renata had apparently never explained to her homeowners, and what I made very clear.
HOA members are not just residents of a community.
They are co-owners of a legal entity. When that entity loses a lawsuit, the judgment is paid from reserve funds every homeowner contributes to through annual assessments. When reserves are insufficient, which HOA boards chronically underfund, the board can levy special assessments against individual properties to cover the shortfall. In cases where board members acted outside their authority or in bad faith, those directors face personal liability. The membership had a right to know this. Nobody had told them. I watched each of those 6 people go through the same sequence. Confusion, then comprehension, then anger, not at me, at the board, at Ranat. Ada, one man, a retired electrician named Walt, told me in a voice gone very flat and very quiet that Renata had pushed the 2019 CCC&R amendment through at a meeting where 12 homeowners attended on 3 days' notice and had described it in the meeting announcement as a routine update to common area maintenance provisions. She put parking update in the subject line of the email. Walt said, "So people didn't come. Nobody drives out on a Tuesday night over parking." And then she passed an amendment that grabbed your land with 12 people in the room, 4 of them board members. A parking update that had attempted to claim property my grandfather owned since 1961. I asked Walt if he'd say that publicly, at the annual meeting on the record. He said yes immediately. The tone of that yes told me he had been waiting for a place to say it. Meanwhile, Darla had been managing a parallel track. A property rights journalist, a freelancer covering HOA abuse cases for a regional outlet with a substantial Tennessee readership, had reviewed our public court filings and spoken with 2 other neighboring landowners who'd received boundary inquiries from Renata. His story was written and ready. Darla had negotiated the timing carefully. It would publish the morning after the annual meeting. We didn't want Renata to see it coming and cancel or reschedule. Septon had secured a temporary restraining order preventing any further HOA work within 50 feet of my property boundary, pending final resolution of the litigation. Renata's attorney objected. The judge's response was 11 words. The property interest at stake is clear, and the risk is real. TRO granted. We arranged for a certified court reporter to attend the annual meeting. HOA meetings are recorded proceedings under the bylaws, but those recordings belong to the HOA. An independent court reporter created a neutral transcript belonging to no P, already inadmissible in any proceeding. Renata had no grounds to exclude her. She would sit in the back, machine running, capturing every word. On Thursday, 48 hours before the meeting, Renata's attorney called Darla with a settlement offer, $50,000, written acknowledgement that the easement was valid, mutual release of all claims. We had $250,000 in documented filed exposure, a void easement confirmed by 2 independent attorneys, an active TDEC investigation with a willful non-compliance finding, a defamation claim with the original email as evidence, trail camera footage of committee trespass, board minutes from 2016 through 2019, documenting the scheme's origins, deleted Facebook comments screenshotted. Walt, ready, willing, and looking forward to Saturday. Vera, front row with her envelope in her good coat. Darla's response letter was 3 sentences. The meeting was in 48 hours. The Pinarest Pines Community Center holds about 200 people in folding chairs. That Saturday evening, 253 showed up. Word had moved through the neighborhood the way financial fear always moves, person to person, over back fences, with the specific urgency of homeowners who have begun to suspect that something done in their name might cost them money they didn't agree to spend. The journalist was in the back row with a notebook. Deputy Sorrells stood near the side door in plain clothes, present because Darla had informed the sheriff's department that the meeting involved matters under active civil and state regulatory investigation. The court reporter sat against the wall, machine assembled, waiting. The room smelled like burnt coffee and synthetic carpet and the faint chemical sweetness of industrial floor cleaner on old linoleum. Renata stood at the podium in a charcoal blazer, composed folder in front of her, attorney at the table to her left. She looked exactly as she always looked, the most prepared person in the room, the person who had already read every document and calculated every outcome. Darla and I sat in the 3rd row. Septon was 2 seats to my left. Foe was behind us. Vera Castleberry occupied the front row center seat, her 140-page envelope on her lap, wearing her good wool coat. The meeting opened with standard business. Minutes approval, treasurer's report, maintenance updates. Renata moved through it efficiently. Then she reached the agenda item she had titled Eastern Boundary Legal Update. She had prepared remarks. She was going to characterize the claims as frivolous and explain the board's confidence in the outcome. She got 4 minutes in. Walt raised his hand and stood up slowly. Retired electrician, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who doesn't get to his feet in a public meeting unless he intends to finish what he started. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when someone decides to say the thing everyone has been afraid to say. Miss Holloway, can you tell this membership the total dollar amount of legal exposure these claims represent? Legal counsel is evaluating the claims. We're not in a position to share a figure at this time. The court filings are public record, Walt said. I pulled them this week. Would you like me to share what they say? Renata's attorney began to rise. Renata placed one hand on his arm, a small, precise gesture, and he sat back down. She looked at Walt for 2 seconds. The floor opens for comment during the designated period, she said. Not now. Darla stood up. She identified herself as the attorney for the adjacent property owner and formally requested the floor under Robert's Rules of Order, which the Pinterest Pines bylaws required the chair to grant during the open comment segment. Renata granted it. She had no legal basis to refuse, and she knew that refusing the floor to opposing counsel in front of 253 witnesses was the worst position. Darla spoke for 14 minutes, clear, measured, not one raised voice. She explained the void easement, what it meant legally, that the CCNR amendment had no effect on an adjacent owner never properly noticed, and how it had been described to the membership as a parking update. She put $12,000 on the whiteboard. She put $67,000 beside it. She added attorney's fees and teeted civil penalties as a range, and stated clearly that these were current filed amounts, public court record verifiable tonight. Then I want to direct the membership's attention to the HOA board meeting minutes of March 14, 2018. She held up Vera's bound document. These minutes reflect a discussion in which 3 members of the drainage subcommittee voted to pursue an easement claim over the adjacent property as, and I am quoting directly, a cost-effective solution to the retention capacity deficit. Those same 3 members voted to approve the 2019 CC&R amendment providing cover for that plan. 2 personally signed the landscaping contract, including the unauthorized pipe installation. Under Tennessee law, a board member who votes on a matter in which they hold an undisclosed personal interest has potentially breached their fiduciary duty to this membership. I strongly suggest every homeowner in this room consult independent counsel regarding your individual exposure as co-owners of this entity. 253 people exhaling at once sounds like a pressure valve releasing. Renata's hands were flat on the podium. Her attorney was on his feet. Walt was standing talking. 3 other homeowners were up. The court reporter's machine clicked steadily. The journalist had stopped writing and was just watching. Then Vera Castleberry stood up, 81 years old, barely 5'2", in her good wool coat. I seconded the motion to table the 2018 discussion, she said, her voice carrying clearly. I told the board that what they were proposing was wrong. I was outvoted 4-1. I have kept these minutes since that night because I knew this day would come. I am glad it has. 3 seconds of silence, then it was over. Renata Holloway resigned the presidency of the Pinterest Pines HOA that evening. Stated in the same flat, controlled voice she used for everything that she was stepping down, effective immediately, gathered her folder, and walked out. Her attorney followed without speaking. The 2 most implicated board members recused themselves before the membership could formally call for their removal. The remaining board member, a quiet woman named Pat, outvoted on nearly every relevant decision for 3 years, was asked to serve as acting president. She said yes, and the expression on her face was the most honest thing that had happened in that community center in a very long time. The settlement came 8 weeks after the meeting. The HOA, acting through its reconstituted board and new legal counsel, agreed to payment of $118,000 in combined timber, trespass, and environmental remediation damages, formal retraction and county-recorded voiding of the 2019 easement amendment, complete removal and professional remediation of all unauthorized drainage infrastructure at the HOA's sole expense, a binding stormwater management covenant designating a Tating My Spring corridor and lake as a protected downstream interest in perpetuity, and a written public apology printed in the HOA quarterly newsletter, and posted on the community's official website for 30 days. Ranatata Holloway and the two implicated board members were denied HOA indemnification coverage after an independent review found their actions constituted bad faith conduct outside the scope of authorized board authority. All three retained personal counsel. Renata's personal exposure in the defamation claim was settled separately under a confidentiality agreement. I won't give you the number, but her black Lexus SUV appeared on Facebook Marketplace 5 months after the settlement closed. Draw your own conclusions. Tents collapsed, issued a notice of violation against Pinerist Pines with $34,000 in civil penalties for the multi-year unpermitted discharge. The HOA was required to retain a licensed civil engineer to design and implement a compliant stormwater management plan, subject to quarterly state inspections for 2 years. The cost of that engineering and implementation separate from the penalties ran another $80,000 from operating reserves. Pat sent the membership a candid letter explaining the special assessment that would be required. The membership approved it, not happily, but honestly. The lake is recovering. We completed remediation last spring, dredged the nutrient-laden sediment from the inlet, restored the shoreline vegetation buffer, reseeded the drainage corridor with native riparian plants. Watching it week by week was almost meditative. The phosphorus levels are down significantly. The water has clarity it hasn't had in 6 years. Last October, I pulled a 3PB largemouth out of the north end, right where the spring enters the lake, where Earl used to keep his aluminum rowboat tied to a willow route. I sat on the bank for a long while, just listening to the water. There is something about a body of water your family has owned for 60 years. It has weight. It has memory. Earl bought that lake because he loved to fish and because he understood that water is not a convenience. It is wealth in the oldest sense. He wrote it into the deed carefully, through an attorney who knew what he was doing. He couldn't have known that those 28 words would be the pivot point of a fight that ended with a corporate cold HOA president walking out of a community meeting while a court reporter captured every word, but I think he would have appreciated the poetry of it. The Winslow Lake Conservation and Scholarship Fund was established the following spring, funded partly by the settlement and partly by a modest annual access fee for supervised catch and release fishing events, which I opened to the public for the first time through Bledsoe County's 4-H and FAA programs. 37 high school students have fished that lake in the past 2 years. The fund has awarded 3 scholarships to students pursuing degrees in environmental science, land management, or agricultural law. Earl believed in young people who understood how land worked. I think he would have liked these kids. The new HOA under Pat's leadership planted 12 native white oak saplings along the eastern boundary, staked and caged, 2 in diameter to replace the 5 trees that were cut. They invited me to the planting. I went. It was a little awkward standing there in the cold with people I'd spent 6 months fighting in court, but the trees went into the ground, and the roots will hold. Dope, so that's what a $434,000 pal looks like. One lock, one known in this cursive in 60 years of Daniel family history, used at a beginning trip by someone who's been in New Haven for less than 2 years. Here's what stay with me about this story. Dell didn't win because he got lucky. He won because his grandfather did the work 70 years ago, and Dell was the one who actually read it. Pace 9 opponently closed. Nobody had ever needed to use $8,200 per day. That's not revenge. That's preparation meeting moment. Most of us own property with documents we never fully read. Eastman covenants, agreements, signed before we were born, and somewhere in the pit, maybe pit 9, maybe pit 12, either protect you completely or leave you completely exploded. Family found that out the hard way. If you got a gate, a fence, a shared driveway, or any kind of easement on your property, put the original documents that weekend, not the summary, the original. Because the people who wrote the agreements in 1954 were thinking about fire season. They were thinking about you 70 years later in exactly situation. Don't find out what is there the way Beverly did. Have you ever had a neighbor or a Noah put something like this on you? Drop it in the comments. The most arrogant ones get their own episode. If this story hit different, share it with someone who owns property as surprise because Nick's story makes Beverly look like a beginner. The lock, cost her $12. The clause trigger cost her $434,000. Read your documents.